Hi there, welcome to the latest edition of the Front Page. Loads to get through in this week's edition, not least the major changes to the British fixture list that will come in 2024. Many of them wrapped up around the term premierisation. No doubt who is at the top of jump racing in Britain and Ireland. That is Willie Mullins. We'll be asking if his domination of the sport is healthy or not. And talking of champions, we'll be looking forward to Saturday's 2023 running of the Betfred Derby, one that could become a rolling news story due to planned disruption by the pressure group Animal Rising. All that then in this week's edition of the Front Page. As ever, we ask you to like, comment, share and subscribe to your heart's desire. And I'm sure that would delight the two gentlemen sat to my left. Award-winning writer Jonathan Harding and soon-to-be multi-award-winning writer as well, West Country correspondent James Stephens. You both well?
Yeah, very well. Very much looking forward to the big week for the sport and Derby Day. And yeah, so it's all coming together nicely, isn't it? The weather's getting nicer, so yeah, it's just shame there's not enough jump racing these days. But
although the weather impacts folk like us with hay fever, you've been struggling.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's why the red eyes. It's not bank holiday alcohol related at all.
Good to know. Jonathan, how are your eyes?
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, no hay fever?
No, apart from needing glasses, all good. No complaints.
Good man. Okay, before we start off with our first story, I wish to remind you that we have a most excellent offer for the Racing Post Members Club. Okay, our first story this week is in relation to the changes to the fixture list in Britain in 2024 and 2025 that followed a meeting of the BHA board. With details, James Stephens.
Yeah, so as you mentioned at the top of the show, we are talking about premierisation. I can finally get there in the end. But yeah, this is essentially the concept where British Racing is going to use a 2-hour window on Saturday afternoons to highlight all of the best events of the sports and major meetings as well. And this window on a Saturday is clear that anyone sort of interested or wanting to know about racing can go, right, if I look through this time, these are going to be the best races, the best horses, the best jockeys, and really sort of using this as a way to market the sport to wider interest, outside interest, and to promote betting turnover as well. So there's a number of different elements of the fixture list that's emerged this week. That is the sort of the headline one. 6 Sunday evening fixtures to be trialled in 2024, which is a huge talking point in the game because Sunday racing it's taken a long time to come into British racing, and then we've had the Sunday series, which is in the evening, and now it seems like there's a bit more intent to use that slot in the window. The only really part of the week where there isn't racing could now be more commonly used for horse racing. So it's going to be 6 Sunday evening fixtures to be trialled on the all-weather under the floodlights. And they've also going to axe 300 jump races, which we talked a lot about the fixture list and how much racing there is, the competitiveness of racing. So about 40 meetings from jumps are going to go, and there's also going to be some moving and flat racing as well. We've also got an extended break over jumps, so that's going to be expanded to try and give everybody involved in the industry a bit more time.
19 days.
19 days, yeah. And so essentially we've learned a bit more. This is the sort of first step of this industry strategy. This is the first time the BHA have had and the relevant party have had the power to say, right, let's improve the sport, and they've started off with essentially wanting to use a slot in the window, a slot in the calendar, the shop window of the sport as they call it, to really sell the sport and push it forward, because as we've talked about in here, tendencies are down, the sport needs to promote itself a bit more, and by creating a clear window, it's hoped that that's going to sort of promote it as they expect.
Yes, indeed. I suppose two things maybe to start off the discussion. One is that there had been, I think, an acknowledgement that doing nothing was not the right approach. but doing something in British racing has traditionally been difficult because of the governance structures under which the industry was managed, if you like. Now that has changed in recent months with the creation of various different committees. The commercial committee, industry-wide commercial committee, put forward these proposals to the BHA board, which is now empowered to make decisions. I suppose, first of all, Jonathan, the fact that a decision has been made and something is going to happen, that presumably indicates that the system works.
Yeah, I mean, that represents progress in itself, and given this, arguably quite radical nature of these changes, you can imagine under the old system with the power of veto and the fact that not everybody is going to be pleased with every change, you could see that would have probably led to an enormous logjam, and we'd be in exactly the same position as we were for forever, essentially. So it's really encouraging to see. I think generally the driving force behind it is encouraging, the fact that they recognise that radical change is needed. I think this shop window idea is promising. It makes sense to push the best product in the most effective way possible. But I think it depends on what you're selling. My slight concern is that a lot of this appears to be driven by a desire to boost betting turnover, and we can't be so naive as to think that that's not an enormous factor in the sports finances. But at the same time, particularly with this protected window, for instance, and smaller tracks, I just worry that perhaps footfall and getting people through the gates has perhaps become slightly secondary. I don't know. But just on a general point, I think it's quite encouraging that something's happened.
The footfall point is one that's clearly been a talking point going into this, because there was, James, or there has been a threat of legal action from smaller independent racecourses who will lose out as a result of this shop window. So that on 2/3 of Saturdays in 2024, there will be 3 meetings on a Saturday, 2 premier meetings and 1 core meeting, i.e. 1 meeting from the rest. And on 1/3 of Saturdays, that will increase to 4 meetings. But it will mean that some tracks, often smaller indies, will have to stage their racing predominantly after the shop window meetings have taken place. There is a morning option, but it's thought more likely that 4 PM meetings will become the norm. And a lot of those tracks have said that won't work for us. We won't get the numbers that we would get had we raced in the 2 to 4 PM shop window. The suggestion has been that the threat of legal action might have receded, partly because there's been some sort of compromise reached with this 2/3, 1/3 split, and also because a lot of the racecourses have been putting forward voluntary suggestions for meetings that they're happy to go with outside of the shop window. So that sounds promising. But I suppose 2 questions to you. One, Julie Harrington and Joe Smith both stated last week that it would be wrong to say that betting turnover is being placed as more important than racecourse attendances. Does that square with what they've done? And 2, will the shop window make any difference? And by that I mean, on Saturday, for example, Hexham stages an amateur rider's handicap hurdle 25 minutes before the Derby. Now, will that do anything to diminish from the standing of the Derby? I'm not so sure. So for that one and the attendances question. Okay,
so to start with the attendances, I think that attendances are in themselves a very big shop window, and Saturday afternoons particularly are. I mean, I worked about a month ago reporting the story about arena racing companies saying that they were having to have less music nights because essentially the cost to hire these acts had got to such a point, and the fact that attendances are generally dropping means that they couldn't be sure they were going to turn a profit. Now, looking at the numbers and doing some number crunching of that, those events were huge. Like the crowds they would draw in for those big music nights would go far and beyond what they would normally get on a normal meeting and a normal Saturday meeting. So there are ways in which meetings like those big Saturdays can draw in a crowd, and as such, you know, if you say somebody enjoys themselves, they could be a fan of a sport from going. So that's going to be a key area. And I think that naturally, if there's going to be less meetings, there's going to be less chances for people to fall in love with the sport from going racing. So yeah, it's a worry, but there has been a bit of compromise, and you know, it is the early stages. This is all sort of new, so it might be that okay, well maybe we could have another meeting. These things sometimes change, so it's going to be interesting, but I think essentially one element of a shop window will be impacted, so that's interesting. In terms of the idea of the 2 p.m. to 4 p.m.
Will it work?
Will it work? Well, I find this really, really interesting because, firstly, we're about to run the derby on Saturday at 1:30, so it avoids a clash essentially with the football. They've put a slot in 2 p.m. to 4 p.m, which will always clash with Premier League football. Now, I don't quite understand that. Now, this is data-driven. That's one of the things the BHA and the releases said. It's data-driven. It's all about using the numbers, not just in betting, but you know, viewing figures and all of those different indicators to judge whether if something is right or wrong. They're going to use. But for me, I've spoken to bookmakers before who always say that Premier League football betting is miles more. The turnover of that is miles more than it would be a race, let alone the amateur race at Hexham. So it's interesting that they are going to clash with that, and also from a sort of looking at modern football now, and people can. I mean, the old way of doing it was that at 3 p.m. Premier League football matches were blacked out and you couldn't watch them, so you'd watch Soccer Saturday or something. The game has changed a lot, and people now have access, not necessarily legal access, to watch any match they want to now. So whether they go to football matches or whether they watch from home, it's a lot more accessible. So racing has that competition. A 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. slot would avoid that competition, but it's going to be interesting. And finally, your point, will it work? I think the important thing about all of this is that we have to treat it as a trial and learn from it and use the data. And the only thing I was a bit let down by the whole thing is that a lot of it was about data and a lot of it was about we're going to use the decisions. We haven't seen it.
No, and there's still a lot of data to be discovered. We still don't know how much the racecourse is moving out of that 2 to 4 p.m. shop window, how much they're going to be compensated by. We don't know as yet what the new minimum levels will be for these Premier fixtures, because in effect, racecourses that are staging these Premier fixtures should receive more external funding from the levy board. I think that's the plan to help boost prize money, allied with their own executive contributions going up. And we don't know as well yet what the future shape of Sundays will be, because one ambition, as well as those 6 floodlit Sunday evenings between January and March, there is a desire to stage Premier meetings on Sundays and to have more quality racing on Sundays, hopefully with ITV mainstream coverage. So there's still a lot we need to know, but overall, are you pleased with what came out last week?
Yeah, I am pleased. I think I like the idea of premierisation and sort of singling out that product as something slightly different, because I think it can occasionally get lost among the other slightly cluttered Saturdays. But there's obviously a balance to be struck, and I think as long as it's not at the expense of smaller tracks and smaller meetings that offer their own they offer something slightly different, but they still offer something very important in terms of footfall and attendances and everything else on those busy Saturdays for them. So yeah, more than anything, I'm just overwhelmingly pleased that people are actually making decisions and considering new ideas and trying to do something that's data-driven rather than just a product of endless arguing between people that will never ultimately have the same values in terms of what they need to get out of the sport, racecourses, trainers, for them to all be maybe not always on the same page, but loosely on the same page that something had to change and we're going to try it, is a positive step. Sundays worry me to an extent because I think the practicalities of that hasn't quite been worked out. I know there's a fair bit of consternation on social media and from certain people about what about stable staff, what about the logistics of racing on a Sunday evening. I mean, I like the idea of having good racing on a Sunday. It makes sense, just like you have good football on a Saturday and a Sunday, just like you have good sport at the weekend. That's when people can watch. That's when people hopefully can go, because let's not forget about that. But I think the logistics of Sunday evening fixtures don't quite work for me. That feels like just adding a betting product on the end to try and tip it up another level. If you're going to make stable staff and trainers race on a Sunday, it has to be for good prize money, otherwise it's pointless. And I feel they have to be compensated for perhaps a quieter day in the week.
What's your general thrust, James?
Yeah, I'd agree with what a lot Jonathan says, because I think that until we see what the Sundays are, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I know trainers will have to need that prize money, because otherwise they're essentially the staff are the ones who are going to suffer, because they have to essentially put more work in, and it changes that whole system of the way the business is run. And so they have to understand and know that it's going to be worth it otherwise. And the other thing it will do is the other concern I have is that if people decide that they don't want to take up Sunday evening meetings because of the fact that it's difficult logistically, it makes it difficult for them, doesn't it, with owners? Because if owners are saying, okay, but that race there would suit that horse, and suddenly it's all going to become quite interesting. So look, it's a trial, and I'm never going to knock in this game, having seen decisions tried to be made and failed. A trial where we look at it and see if it works is not a bad thing for me. And the only thing I would say about if we are going to have this Sunday evening racing, just as Jonathan said, we absolutely need to take the pressure off at another point of the week.
Just two closing points from me. One, I think anyone who was hoping that the fixture list in 2024 will be significantly smaller than it is this year will not have been delighted by what they read last week, even allowing for the reduction of 300 races from the jumps programme, because divisions could bring that number up as well. And just secondly, in terms of the desire to shine a greater light on our top products, a point I made in a column this morning, linked back to something that Claire Baldinger said in an interview I did with her in 2014, where she was saying that she still believes that in mainstream television racing programmes we put too many races into each programme, which means they just become a list of runners, riders and results. And if you look at days like just gone Saturday, where ITV had 5 from Haydock, 2 from Goodwood, 2 from York and 1 from the Curragh, where you have Super Saturday in July with July Cup, John Smith's Cup and the Summer Mile at Ascot. Very hard for those races to really stand out and breathe, but race courses, the top race courses, have always wanted their races to be on ITV, because clearly it makes them more financially lucrative when they have races on ITV for a number of reasons. So I just wonder whether race courses will need to pull back a little bit from what they want with ITV, because if we do want those big races to shine, you maybe need to have more days like we'll have on Saturday, when only one fixture will be broadcast on ITV, which is Epsom, and which brings us in a hopefully near seamless link to story 2 about Derby Day.
That was a lovely transition.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a very big story, and last Friday the Jockey Club was granted this High Court injunction against protesters, namely in this instance those representing Animal Rising, against protesters who would seek to disrupt the race on Saturday by gaining access to the course, sabotage, any which way you could think to do it. That essentially means that it adds another layer of deterrent. It's another deterrent whereby protesters, it's not just trespass, it's not just kind of getting onto access and disrupting a major event, public disorder, it's contempt of court essentially. So it's far more serious now if a protester was thinking about getting onto the course, which would hopefully put a few off. Now, the sort of mood music from Animal Rising's Dan Kidby is that they remain determined to stop the race. This makes absolutely no difference to them, and they are certain in their beliefs that animals shouldn't be used, shouldn't be even in the food system, let alone used for sport. So, as far as they're concerned, this doesn't change anything. I think the Jockey Club was sort of forced to take this step to try and add another layer of protection in addition to all the security measures that they'll have in place. Really, we're in a situation now where the Jockey Club tried the carrot. It tried to say, let's meet up, let's have a dialogue. They have had meetings with Animal Rising to try and understand the position better. There were donuts at the meeting. It was all very amicable, it seems. And they said, look, you can protest outside, no problem with peaceful protests, as we shouldn't, no one should have an issue with peaceful protests, that's fine. That sort of fell on deaf ears, judging by the tone of the emails back saying, thanks for the chat, but we're going to do it anyway. They're now trying the stick, which is, well, we can't have that because you're endangering jockeys, you're going to ruin the event, all sorts of ramifications, as we saw at Aintree, potentially even larger because Epsom's on public land and it's in theory a much easier target. They've tried this stick of, well, we are going to have to seek larger punishments, a bigger deterrent from the High Court. And that seems to have also fallen on deaf ears in that they haven't changed their position, Animal Rising. So really we have a situation where we're all nervously waiting for the derby, and goodness only knows what's going to happen, but it's hard to see what else the Jockey Club, and indeed, as we had in a news story earlier this week, Goodwood, Royal Ascots of this world, what they're going to be able to do, because if 200 plus people storm the track, all the security forces in the world can't stop them.
No, and I think that's right, James, in that I don't think there's much more the Jockey Club could have done to this point. I think they are fully aware that the injunction will almost certainly do very little to prevent action being taken by protesters on Saturday, but they feel that once that injunction is in place, it does give them more leverage to, at the very least, seek prosecutions should anyone seek to break the injunction on Saturday. We do have a very strange situation going into this year's derby, and as I said at the top of the programme, it will be akin to a rolling news story.
Yeah.
Because the Jockey Club, I've spoken to their chief executive, Nevin Truesdale, for a piece that runs later this week. They are pretty confident that protesters will get on the track at some point on Saturday afternoon. They realise that even by spending an extra 150 grand on security and in terms of physical people on the track trying to prevent protesters, and also infrastructure that might prevent protesters, they're still adamant that people probably will get on the track, and their focus will be on removing those people from the track once they get on the track. But as you cited, Epsom is much harder to police than Aintree. The middle of the racecourse is free for the public to roam on. The track will be accessible from both the infield and the outside of the racecourse. It's a very difficult job indeed for the Jockey Club to police this. But yet they are pretty confident that they can get the race staged and run, and they also believe that all this actually provides them with a chance to present a positive platform of all that racing is doing on the welfare front on Saturday. But it is going to be a uniquely complex and potentially controversial derby on Saturday.
Yeah, and you're right about the idea of a rolling news story. That's exactly what's going to be. I mean, we saw on the weekend there was a climate actor from Just Stop Oil was in the Premiership rugby final, went on the pitch and such. So the idea of protesters disrupting sport is big in the news at the minute, and I think that them coming in at Epsom would be the same group after the Grand National, which was a huge story at the time. Yeah. It was on all of the main news channels. It was on the sort of the magazine news channels. I saw, discuss the events and stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think my sort of reflections this week is I think it's sort of a success for the Jockey Club that they've got it in many ways. Because
the injunction.
The injunction, because I think it sort of gives them that legal stance. And look, we don't know how I suppose radical people are and whether that this will stop them. I strongly doubt that many people will, if they plan to go on it. I don't think it's going to stop them, to be honest with you. It make them think twice, which I think is important. And I think that if people do get on the track, which we expect they might, and they do then suffer action, and that story is covered in the main news, which it will be, that again may prompt that idea. But to be honest with you, I think that it's given Animal Rising as well their bit of coverage, and given them a bit of coverage, and it's built up towards them, and it almost seems as much as it's Epsom's big day as it is their big day. So they've been very keen to be at the front and centre of it, and the way I suppose they were at the hearing, met the Jockey Club, they've acted in it quite interestingly. They've sort of made sure that they're a key part of it all. It's not us and them. The dialogue is quite interesting. In terms of what happens in disrupting the race, I mean, there's only so much you can do. The site of a racecourse is huge. When you compare it to any other sporting venue, I mean, it is huge, and the amount of entry points, and it's not like there's this many doors. Here's how many staff on the doors. You've got running rails and all sorts. I mean, my fear, I don't like situations like this. It's not nice to sort of have the sport sort of looked at in that sort of eyes. But I think there is a chance that racing can promote itself. It's going to have a big slot, and I think a lot of eyes will be on it because, people think that it's going to be a bit chaos, and naturally people tune in for a bit of drama. You know, British people aren't always the best people like that, but we're sort of guilty of it. You know, racing has to be pretty proud of itself. Has to, you know, it can look on itself. With the Just Stop Oil protesters, I always think, well, I get people are annoyed and they're frustrated about it, but the cause they're sort of shouting about, it's quite hard to knock, isn't it? It's sort of climate. It's not like a defence of it. Whereas with racing, you know, we've got exceptionally good veterinary care, and the funding that racing creates, it allows that. It creates hundreds of jobs, livelihood up and down the country. The welfare is such a high standard that it sets a standard for other sort of sports and other sort of communities to look at. There's a lot that racing does, and it brings millions of people across the world a lot of enjoyment. We should be proud of what we do, and when people are willing to sort of attack the sport, we can go and say, this is your opinion, this is ours, and let them make the many people, as you say, the middle ground, as you described them in the front page not long, let them decide, and they're people who may not necessarily voice their opinions on social media or out there, but they're certainly listening.
I think that's right. And I think as well, it's a strange situation because Animal Rising have acknowledged in the court papers that were presented to injunction that they completely recognise that the Jockey Club has only the very best intentions for horses, filled with people that love horses, as would be racing's participants. So it's not as though Animal Rising is going in there saying you guys all hate horses.
Yeah, that's why it's so frustrating.
Absolutely.
That horse racing has just become a very useful vehicle for Animal Rising to push a much broader message, which is we don't believe in the use of animals in any way. Yeah. They're not interested in the practicalities of that. They're not interested in the nuances of the uses of animals. They are solely determined to cause as much disruption as possible until there's an entire rethink about how animals are used in society. And racing, unfortunately, has become the first real victim of that. Well, it's like the dairy industry was their first target, but it's not. It's important to note it's not you know, anti-horse racing group. This is a much broader thing that racing has unfortunately just ended up in the crosshairs, and they've used racing as quite cleverly in a way, as a way to put themselves in the mainstream media. I don't know about it as an opportunity for racing to push its welfare message on the back of this, because it's, you know, if they do disrupt the Derby, I'm fairly sure that will be the lead, and at the bottom there'll be a statement from the Jockey Club defending its welfare standards. Most people aren't going to read that far down the story, so I can't see this as being flipped into a good news story. It's just hugely, hugely frustrating.
It is. You'd hope that people will start asking questions of Animal Rising in terms of the flawed logic they have with horse racing.
You'd hope.
You know, what on earth happens to all these thoroughbreds that they don't want to be involved in the racing industry?
Just on Jonathan's part, and I don't necessarily think this will be a positive news story in any way, not at all. I think that what it would be more so is that there's going to be a lot of coverage about it, and there's going to be a lot of people will tune into ITV and stuff, and I think that there is an opportunity for racing to have its voice heard, perhaps. Yeah. Because they choose what they show on the television. If they want to show the protesters, they probably will, but they also have a chance to. Many millions will tune in just to see what might happen. There's no way about it. People will watch the Derby naturally. There's a spot there where racing can get its message across, and hopefully it does it in a good way. That's sort of what I meant. Yeah. So.
Yeah, agree with that. Finally then, we move on from the top tier of flat racing to the top of jump racing, and the top man in jump racing, who is Willie Mullins. And last week across 2 days, very much helped by our head of data, Craig Thake, who helped to produce lots of information and stats relating to Willie Mullins. We tried to paint a picture of his domination of jump racing at the moment in Ireland and also in Britain, and asked people what they thought of that. Just some of the numbers here, and my memory is not going to remember. So I'm going to read these out. Forgive me. So across the last decade, prize money in Irish jump racing increased by €7 million. Willie Mullins won around half of that, 47%. Last season, he won 24% of all Irish prize money in jump racing. He won 68% of the Grade 1s staged in Irish jump racing last season. In 2012 to 13, he had 27% of all runners in Irish Grade 1s. Last season, that had grown to 47% of all runners in Irish Grade 1s, and he had 45% of the horses that hit an RPR Racing Post rating of 150 plus in Ireland last season. So astonishing statistics, backed up by Willie having the first, second and third, or the first, second and third and fourth in lots of big races across the season. In part 2 of the piece, I spoke to some key players in the Indies to try and gauge reaction to this domination. We had a column from the trainer Owen Griffin recently that basically pleaded for some sort of intervention and said how the domination and the rise of superpower trainers was impacting many more trainers further down the food chain. Horse Racing Ireland made clear that this is always a subject that's under discussion, but that they are not minded towards a sort of cap or intervention that one of our colleagues, Chris Cook, has often called for on this programme and in the Racing Post. And HRI referenced the fact that the Irish Racehorse Trainers Association has historically been against any sort of cap on the number of runners a trainer can have in a race, maybe the number of horses a trainer can have in a stable, and the IRTA. So that's not just their position, that's a widely held view. Anthony Bromley, who is a prominent bloodstock agent but also racing manager to 2 of Willie's big owners, Simon Neer and Isaac Swade, said for him the key thing is that Willie runs his best horses against each other. They're not all filtered apart to different big meetings. They actually compete, as we saw at the Punchy Sound Festival when he had 4 of the 5 in the 2 mile champion chase and the first 4 home. Ted Walsh, current trainer, now former broadcaster, he made the point that, obviously he goes back a little bit further than we do, when he was growing up, Tom Draper, the trainer of Arkle and Flying Bolt, was the trainer supreme. And Ted said that in those days there are as many trainers struggling as there are now. And one difference is that Tom Draper didn't actually always run his best horses against each other. Arkle and Flying Bolt didn't ever race in the same contest. They were kept apart. But Ted made that point that Willie does run his best horses against each other, which for the purists he sees as a very good thing. But he did acknowledge, with his broadcasting hat on, that it is quite difficult to keep telling people why they should be interested in the same person winning all the races. And he presented an analogy, a metaphor that if you went in, or you're planning to go in to watch The Shawshank Redemption, would you do that if you already knew what happened at the end of the film? You have to have some sort of unknown to sport to make it interesting. And Ted also made an interesting point that back in Tom Draper's day, the programme was very different, and the vast majority of the top contests were handicaps. Whereas these days, the majority of the top contests have become weight for age conditions races, which make it easier for someone in Willie Mullins' position to farm those races than if they were handicapped. So Ted, like HRI and like the RTA, wouldn't want to see a cap imposed on Willie Mullins, but he would like to see a change to the programme. And HRI did say that there is a process at the minute looking at the Irish jumps pattern, as there has been one in Britain in the last 2 years. So, James, as West Country correspondent, you are almost a spokesperson for some of our top jumps trainers on a regular basis. Dan Skelton said he wouldn't want to see any sort of cap on Willie Mullins or anyone else. What's your take on this domination of the sport by one person, and whether it's a thing that should be celebrated, a healthy thing, or a thing that should be regretted and that should lead to some sort of intervention from governing bodies?
Very dull and sit on the fence, I think, here on that one. I think it's very hard, and I get the idea of caps, and I get the idea of stopping trainers. You know, the idea that sort of put forward of too many horses in the yard. I sort of just think there's always going to be loopholes with that are somewhat can be exploited. You know, if it's not in Willie Mullins' name, it's in someone other's name, that it's still part of the Willie Mullins team. So I'm not sure about that. In terms of the amount of runners or a yard can have in a race, what would have happened at Punchestown? I mean, we say, oh, he had the first 4 of the first 5 home. There might have been a match. So it's difficult. I don't think it should be celebrated as such, because I think it's a warning almost. Those numbers are pretty damning. You know, it's like quite scary that someone has that much dominance, and it's something you have to be aware of. But at the same time, it's punishing for success, isn't it? And what point does someone become that successful that they have to have the rules changed? So I think at this point in time, it wasn't too long ago that Gordon Elliott was sort of flying through the ranks and was almost sort of champion at one point, wasn't it? Only until the last day of Punchestown or something. So it has progressed quite rapidly. I suppose that the way I look at it is I think that Ted Walsh sort of touches upon in your piece, and Dan Skelton as well, is trainers can be very fashionable, you know, they go out of fashion quite quickly, and less say they go out of fashion, but more trainers become more fashionable more so. So someone comes in and has a couple of winners, and suddenly the top owners are beginning to look. And I think that's what a lot of it's about, is where those horses are decided to be sent to. And the fact that Willie Mullins continues to have those Cheltenham winners is always going to be the big thing. But years go by, and some trainers who perhaps don't have the more high profile sale horses or the big names, but still manage to maybe win a handicap, maybe win a graded race, maybe that people are beginning to look and go, maybe we'll give them a try. And the system evolves. So at this point in time, I'm more watching it, but I'm watching it less so in awe, but more so a little bit cautious, and I think that you said, I think, you know, we've got a champion trainer in Paul Nicholls. It wasn't too long ago he had all those sort of horses, and we probably, if we were sat there, we'd be having similar conversations. So I'm happy to watch and wait, but it's definitely something I'm alert to, I think.
Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely that any governing body will do anything to try and intervene, albeit you have countries like Japan where the JRA does impose a limit on the number of horses a trainer can have in their stable. Jonathan, you were saying we don't have a green room, sadly, but if we did have a green room, you were saying in the green room,
over some nibbles,
that in other sports there are ways in which governing bodies do intervene to try and limit the potential power of any one individual or team.
Yeah, and I think we need to be careful of making this Willie Mullins is the latest example. I think we've got to be careful of making this an individual thing, and I would not be a fan of penalising success. I don't think caps are necessarily a good idea, because practically how do you bring them in, as James has touched on there. I think Willie Mullins should be celebrated. I think his results are essentially a symptom, and what they need to be doing is actually going further back and looking at, okay, why is he in this position? And then you try and determine whether the playing field is indeed as level as it ought to be. Now, that's where you might be able to curb some of the power, if you're looking at the number of horses in races, if you're looking at the number of horses owners are able to have with 1 yard, certain things like that. I don't think any of them practically would work, but I think you need to go further back than just looking at the results and going, oh, we need to stop Willie Mullins somehow. I think it's about creating, sport relies on a level playing field, and if there's any indication that's not the case, I'm not saying that is where we are at the moment, but if there's any situation that he has some sort of competitive advantage that's not sort of gained through just simply success, whether there's some way the system is geared towards his way of doing things. Well, and in terms of other sports, I mean, that's fairly common in football, financial fair play, and in a lot of American sports you have the better teams then they pick the next crop of players last because they were the winners, and therefore the other teams are given a slight edge. Those are the sort of things I'd be looking at to perhaps bring other trainers up, make them more competitive, offer them more opportunities at the lower end of the sport, rather than taking action against the top end, because ultimately Willie Mullins hasn't really done anything wrong.
And that's something else you have to stress as well, isn't it? You can't criticise someone for being incredibly good at what they do. He hasn't done anything wrong, but I suppose the danger at the minute is the domination could become even more stark and noticeable, because as people argue in the piece, success breeds success, and Ted Walsh had a line about if you're an owner, you want to have that Bruce Springsteen moment after a Cheltenham Festival race where you are all of a sudden the world's looking at you, and Willie Mullins is the person who is deemed to be the most likely individual to be able to achieve that, and that's partly because he does allow his best horses to race against each other. Andy Bromley argued if you go into Clersutton, you know that if you have a grade 1 horse, whether you have 1 horse or 40 horse in the yard, that horse will be given a chance to shine. So
I think racing is slightly complicated compared to other sports in that it's sort of a series of disparate personal businesses that have been fused together into a sport. whereby, take Formula One for example, well, you've got these teams and then we put a spending cap in place and all the cars are broadly similar, so we have a completely level playing field. Okay, you get competitive advantages whereby Red Bull can get the best driver in Max Verstappen, just like Willie Mullins can get the best horses, but ultimately there's not a huge amount to split them beyond slight detail, whereas you can't essentially limit a business from flourishing, because that's ultimately where it gets to, I think.
Yeah, agree. Okay, that then was Willie Mullins' domination of jump racing. We've spoken about premierisation. We've spoken about the Derby on Saturday. Time now for me to try and determine which one of these stories should be the winning front page story of the week. I never like making my own story the top story. And we are in the flat season, so we'll leave that one to one side for now. As for the Derby, well, it could well be the front page story next week, and I hope that's because we're celebrating a superb Derby winning performance as opposed to any action from Animal Rising, but we'll leave that one for 7 days. And James, bear in mind you were talking about the whole future, in a way, of British horse racing. I think you deserve to be the winner this week. Congratulations.
Well, if I can win the front page, then who knows, maybe someone can take Willie Mullins off the top, so maybe there's a bit of confidence to the other trainers who are taking him on next season.
Beautiful words there from our West Country correspondent, and that brings us to the end of this week's edition, except that I need to tell you that you really should be downloading the Racing Post app. Yes, do download the app. It is a fabulous thing indeed. I've been joined by two fabulous colleagues in James Stevens and Jonathan Harding. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to the boys. I am Lee Mottershead. I will be next week, but at this point next week, Tom Kerr will be in the chair. Please do join him for the next edition of The Front Page. Until then, bye-bye.